Hi, this is Jim LaValle with the Da Vinci Labs Education Series, and today we're going to talk about glucose metabolism, but really it's not just about glucose control, it's also about the other organs and other systems that play a role in how glucose ends up being utilized in your body. So we'll visit today adrenal, thyroid, pancreas a little bit, as well as sleep as major areas of disruption that causes problems with your glucose metabolism. Obviously, you can't hardly think about glucose metabolism or how to help the pancreas to regulate blood sugar without thinking about cortisol and thyroid hormone at the same time. Because this network or this relationship is a central regulator of physiology. It's core to creating metabolic balance, and of course, we all know people that are insulin resistant and have diabetes probably are the furthest from metabolic balance. When this relationship is out of control, energy production is off. So as you don't utilize glucose well, you get blood sugar drops during the course of the day. You can't metabolize that glucose off and utilize it for energy appropriately. And when this relationship is working and when blood glucose is being utilized well, a person will feel vital and have a sense of well-being. And when they're imbalanced, they get fatigued and they gain weight. We all realize that one of the major reasons for why we have an obesity epidemic and just people being overweight epidemic in this country is the fact that many of our U.S. citizens have insulin resistance. So a little bit of background. Obviously, clinically diagnosed blood sugar problems affect about 25.8 million Americans as of 2011. 18.8 million diagnosed with blood sugar problems, 7 million undiagnosed. I guess there's a statistic that would say that 50% of the U.S. population either has insulin resistance issues or may have progressed to type 2 diabetes. 90% of people with clinically diagnosed blood sugar problems in the United States are type 2 diabetics. And then the incidence of diagnosed blood sugar problems has gone up by 50% over the last 30 years. So the reality is blood sugar metabolism issues are on the rise. For all the knowledge that we have, for everything we know about how dangerous it is to have blood sugars that are out of balance, more and more people trend in that direction. More and more people are suffering from the metabolic consequences of that. And it's thought right now that honestly, it depends which statistics you see, but between 24 and 38% of the U.S. population have insulin resistance. And that means that a lot of those folks are in danger of creating further metabolic disruption from their insulin resistance. Obviously the pancreas sits underneath the stomach, secretes insulin from the beta cells, and it also secretes glucagon and bicarbonate. We're going to focus on glucose today because we only have a little bit of time, but I think it's important that we understand just how critical it is at the cellular level that we manage glucose regulation. So, insulin obviously is secreted by the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans, and insulin is released in order to get glucose out of that bloodstream, glycogen storage up into the liver and up into muscle tissue. So insulin's role was to lower blood glucose. Of course, when insulin is being released inefficiently, meaning that you become insulin resistant, you start to release too much insulin. And insulin is anabolic, so tissues can grow. Insulin can cause you in excess to store fat. Insulin in excess is inflammatory. In fact, some consider it to be the most inflammatory signaling compound in your body. So insulin inhibits the breakdown of glycogen, fat, and protein. And of course, excess insulin being pro-inflammatory and nutrient depleting. So when you have a lot of insulin or someone is being administered insulin, it can have an effect on magnesium, chromium, vitamin D, and zinc. all of which are important. And of course, one of the big things that we're trying to do is balance out the highs and lows in individuals. So we know that the biggest single thing that contributes to plaquing of your arteries is postprandial hyperglycemic response, meaning the upward swings in glucose that occur after a meal that's too high in sugar and too high in starch triggers the events that lead to endothelial dysfunction. So it's important to regulate insulin and regulate blood sugar because it has multiple metabolic effects on your body, including a whole host of conditions. So when you think of insulin resistance, it's linked to chronic illnesses like diabetes, heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, high blood pressure, and there could be a lot of different reasons why people become insulin resistant. It could be due to stress. It could be due to just eating too much sugar and carbs, which is, I think, a problem that a lot of us have in our culture. We're not really all that active, but we tend to overfeed. I know we talked about that in the diet component and earlier in the series. If you have more fat cells will trigger more insulin resistance due to the adipokines or the hormones that are being secreted by fat cells. Not having enough physical activity can cause these problems. Hormonal influences, low thyroid, which we'll talk about in a little bit, elevated cortisol, inflammatory response can trigger insulin resistance, as can environmental toxicity. So in the big scheme of things, it's important to understand that people who have blood glucose balance issues have most likely several reasons why their blood sugar isn't performing as well as it could be. Most of which we used to think was simply lifestyle, meaning exercise more, eat less, eat the right foods when you're eating less. But we now know that things like pesticides, low thyroid output, decreased mineral status like magnesium and B vitamins and chromium and zinc, all of these things can affect the insulin receptor. And there's a lot of, once again, contributing factors that you have to think of. So, genetics could play a role to a certain extent. Decreased muscle mass, so less lean mass, less ability to stack that glycogen up on muscle. Remember, muscle is the currency of your metabolism. So when you're losing muscle, you're losing your metabolic capacity, and that has a dramatic impact on individuals who are struggling with balancing their glucose. Obviously, we talked about increased belly fat, increased oxidative stress and inflammation, chronic stress, sleep problems are a big deal for regulating blood glucose. Eating too many high glycemic index foods, bowel terrain imbalances, so people that are, yeasty or have bacterial issues can create some blood sugar imbalances. Leptin and adiponectin alterations, obviously the more stress you get under, the more oxidative damage you're under, the less adiponectin you release. Increased resistin. There's a whole host of things that can lead to why insulin receptors just don't work as well and why blood sugar balance becomes a problem. What are some of the things that you see when people have insulin resistance or have poor blood sugar balance? First of all, typically their fasting blood sugar will be just greater than 90. So, it could be somebody, that's going into their doc and they've got a 97 blood sugar and their doc's saying, hey, you're normal, when in fact they're already down the trail of their blood sugar being imbalanced. And we'll go to a study to show that in just a little bit. Obviously, elevated triglycerides can show that insulin resistance can be an issue. Remember, when you're insulin resistant, you're also releasing more adrenaline and noradrenaline, and that makes your blood vessels stiffen up, leading to increases in blood pressure. So even transitory increases in blood pressure, like, 130 over 85, 135 over 80, you should be evaluating that individual to find out where their glucose regulation is at. Other things to think of that you may see in insulin resistance or elevations in C-reactive protein, homocysteine can go up, that people can feel fatigued because they're using way less, they're making way less energy out of the glucose that they use. And we'll go through that in a second. Their brain can be foggy. They can feel like their brain doesn't have enough energy. They can get agitated. They can get headaches. They gain weight. They get mood disturbances. Their body temperature can go low. That's right. In insulin resistance or poor glucose regulation, we can see changes in body temperature regulation. And even you'll see night sweats. So everybody right away thinks, oh my gosh, that's hormones, it's sex hormones. It could be due to insulin resistance that's occurring. So inflammation can cause insulin resistance. So you think of inflammatory compounds like interleukin-6 can trigger insulin resistance. So cortisol could cause insulin resistance. So when inflammatory substances are being released in excessive amounts in the body, it can damage or it can cause the insulin receptors to inactivate. So it can be a significant issue, which breaks down the process of glucose transport. So the reality is, if I'm under stress metabolically, I have a lot of inflammatory compounds that are being released, I can alter my glucose transport because it damages the process of either the insulin receptor or it can inactivate those insulin receptors. And then insulin resistance is a cause of inflammation. So it's one of those vicious cycles, chicken or the egg. So insulin resistance causes an increase in inflammatory markers, and in fact, it's been shown white blood cell counts go up, fibrinogen goes up, which is how sticky your blood is. C-reactive protein goes up as well as interleukin-6. And those chronic inflammatory markers are associated with a whole host of problems for your patients. Aches, pain, sleep problems, weight gain, immune imbalances, hormone imbalances, autoimmune problems, cognitive decline. There's just a number of issues that occur as people become more inflamed due to their insulin resistance. There's a lot of conditions, of course, that are associated with chronic inflammation. We're trying to cut those off. So this particular study was, I think, a landmark study. This was done at Kaiser Permanente, and it followed 46,578 people over 10 years. Everyone had to have less than 100 fasting glucose with no previous diagnosis of diabetes or impaired fasting glucose. And what they did was they grouped people into one of four categories: blood sugars less than 85, 85 to 89, 90 to 94, and 95 to 99. And then what they did is they threw out all the confounding factors, so they looked at Cox regression analysis to look at their incidence of diabetes, and they adjusted for age, sex, body mass index, blood pressure, lipid, smoking, cardiovascular disease, and hypertension. They adjusted for everything. All right, let's take a look at what this study meant. What it meant was for every 1 point above 84, there was a correlation with a 6% increase in risk of developing diabetes. Now, that's a big deal, guys, right? Because you think of that person that's got a 98 blood sugar. So that's 13 points above 84. So right now, you're at a 78% risk, at least. So 8 and 5 is 13 times 6, 78% risk of becoming diabetic in the next decade. And that's with a 98 blood sugar, where you're going into your doctor and they're saying, for the most part, people here, hey, you're still normal. But you have to realize that insulin resistance and glucose disturbances occur over time, and those imbalances lead to conditions further down the road. So the bottom line is that insulin resistance can lead to type 2 diabetes, but it can be developing for well over a decade before traditional lab markers are altered. So sometimes you got to read between the tea leaves and go, hey, your blood sugar's only at 95, but right now you're at a 60% risk of becoming a person with diabetes over the next decade. Let's do something about it. Let's change your diet. Let's take nutrients. Let's get you on exercise. Start getting good sleep. Manage your stress better. All of these things need to be thought of when you're thinking of how to improve blood glucose. So, obviously there's big issues around insulin resistance. I want to spend a little bit of time on what I think is one of the biggest issues. This particular slide kind of shows all of the different common things that occur as people become insulin resistant and they start to trigger chronic inflammation. So if you look on the right, obviously sleep disturbances, low energy, reduced mental capacity, weight gain, erectile dysfunction, mood, fatty liver, macular degeneration, cataracts. Over on the left, as you progress, it starts to lead to big problems like obesity, kidney failure, blindness, retinal damage, neuropathy, nerve damage, pain in the extremities, and all of those leading to bigger problems, which is, heart disease, stroke, cancer, Alzheimer's, and autoimmunity. We're going to talk about cancer because I think it's so important to understand this, guys. This is a textbook that was written several years ago. I had to write a chapter in this textbook, and the title of the textbook was Diabetes and Cancer, Epidemiologic Evidence and Molecular Links. And this is a textbook. And what this really was trying to highlight, it's not highlighting what supplement to use. It's got nothing to do with that. What it's saying is the more your blood sugar is disturbed, the more that you run the risk of your cells becoming damaged, and there's an increased risk associated with being a person with diabetes and developing cancer because of it. So let's take a look at some interesting slides. This was a breast cancer cell on a 5.5 molar glucose culture, and you can see here that the cells put up a little bit of red dye and took it up into the cancer cell. Now they increased the glucose even more, and they we're gonna have to pick that up, Fritz. We'll have to cut this. So it's important to note that all those red speckles are the uptake of glucose into a cancer cell. And then you look at cancer cells at an 11 molar solution, and look what happens. You get more lighting up of the cancer cells. And then we look at these breast cancer cells when they added insulin to the mix, and let's see how inflamed that the cells get. As you can see, the cells get on fire. And it's important to note that when people become insulin resistant, they're moving down the path of cellular inefficiency. And that cellular inefficiency leads to something called GLUT1 dominated transport of blood sugar. So what happens is that we get more glucose throughput into the cell, higher lactate production. So what happens is you, instead of making 38 packets of energy from glucose, you make 2. So your cells become inefficient. They have to suck in more glucose. And so that glucose throughput increases lactic acid production, hence lactic acid dehydrogenase is one of the markers that they track in cancer treatment. And the pH starts to go down within the cell because you're pumping a lot of that lactate and hydrogen ions out into the intracellular space and actually eating up that intracellular space for future growth. The bottom line is the more insulin resistant you become, the less glucose efficient you are, the more you make lactate, the less you make ATP, the more fatigued your muscles will be, the more food you're going to want to eat in order to fuel yourself, and it becomes the conundrum of the person who is struggling with blood glucose balance is that I'm always hungry. Why are you hungry? Because when okay, stop. We're going to have. So the bottom line is when you start to become inefficient at glucose, you start to dominate what's called GLUT1 transport. Basically, in a healthy cell, you use GLUT4 transport, where the insulin receptor is opened up. It takes on the insulin molecule. It signals that glucose be carried into the cell, and then it is burned and creates 38 packets of energy known as ATP. When you go through GLUT1 transport, what happens is that the glucose is diffusing more passively through the cell. So there's a higher glucose throughput because the body is sensing it's less efficient at making energy. More glucose in, you generate less energy from it though. You only make 2 packets of energy, but you also generate a lot of lactic acid within the cell. So you increase your lactic acid that gets spilled out intracellularly, and your lactic acid dehydrogenase hence goes up in your blood test. And that's why they use LDH in cancer cases to see how their therapies are doing. Intracellular pH goes down, and hydrogen ions get pumped into that intracellular space, and that starts to create an erosion of the integrity of the cells and the cell membranes. So this is a big problem when people start to have poor glucose management. It starts to erode literally at the cellular mechanisms that are generating energy, as well as the waste products of your metabolism. Now, to take it one step further, when you're insulin resistant or you have poor glucose management, you end up having more glycation processes take place, right? So glycation is attaching sugar to proteins, and it damages things like the lens of the eye. It can damage other tissues. That's why people who are diabetic end up with more complications to their condition, because a lot of different organs can get damaged. So advanced glycation end products build up in your tissues. They cross-link the proteins and increases the amount of inflammation and damage that's going on in your tissues. So I think I'm setting up this problem correctly in that you want to get glucose control really under your best possible terms, so you limit at a cellular level the amount of damage that's taking place in your body. There's probably not a single more powerful thing you can do to manage aging gracefully and with vitality than taking hold of your insulin resistance. So interesting thing here in terms of lifestyle and insulin resistance. This is way back in 2005. But when they looked at this, those who ate at fast food restaurants twice a week compared to less than once a week gained an extra 10 pounds and had a 2-fold greater increase in their insulin resistance. That's huge, right? I mean, it's what am I eating? What's the quality of what I'm eating? And how does that impact my health? And increasing your insulin resistance is one of the worst things that can happen in terms of a longevity plan. Now, what else can you do? Obviously, exercise is important in insulin resistance because it does so many different things. It improves all the insulin receptor function, so it improves insulin receptor sensitivity. It increases adiponectin, and remember, adiponectin helps your insulin receptors to function, but it's also a marker for oxidative stress. The lower the adiponectin, the higher the oxidative stress. The higher the adiponectin, the lower the oxidative damage going on in your body. Exercise improves glucose transport. It helps with managing lean mass and improving body weight. It also helps with post-meal insulin release, and also helps with glucagon-like peptides. So GLP-1 is important in terms of signaling your brain that you're full. But one of the most important things is that it reduces that postprandial insulin spike, and that is so important because remember, rises in blood sugar and insulin resistance behavior, the single biggest thing that contributes to endothelial dysfunction and laying down plaque in your arteries. And then, of course, once again, blood sugar doesn't operate in a bubble. One of the most important things that you can do to help manage blood sugar for your patients it's adrenal gland response. It's getting cortisol under control. Remember, when cortisol goes up, adrenaline goes up, heart rate, blood pressure goes up. And when cortisol goes up, it literally tells your insulin receptors to get sluggish, to keep more blood sugar in your bloodstream so you can fight that white tiger. It also leads to increasing LDL cholesterol and making more oxidized LDL cholesterol. And cortisol also breaks down muscle. Break down muscle, lose your metabolism, right? You break down muscle, you lose the currency for your metabolism. I can't store glycogen on broken down muscle when it's not there. And then, of course, immunologic functions get changed with the cortisol response, and you start to release more inflammatory compounds like interleukin-6, which have a direct impact on your insulin receptor function and how it works. And, you know, obviously, I know we've had a couple discussions with cortisol in it, but just to review it, cortisol goes high in the day and it's supposed to go down at night. Cortisol high in the day is when your body is actually also knowing how to process food. When you eat late at night, you don't process your food as well, and you can start to trigger problems with insulin resistance due to poor timing of food as well as your stress response. And it's important to see this. We'll just go over a little bit of this. I just want to make sure that in a very simple way, you see chronic cortisol leads to more insulin secretion and more insulin resistance, better fat deposition into your belly fat, meaning you're going to do more of that. Your immune system doesn't regulate as well. You lose muscle. Remember, muscle, the currency of metabolism. When your cortisol is high, you break down muscle, you break down bone. Cortisol will cause your thyroid to become sluggish, and when thyroid hormone's not available, your insulin receptors cannot open up at the cell membrane and catch insulin. So low thyroid will reduce the amount of insulin receptor activity by as much as 20%. And so this is a big problem when you start to see glucose and cortisol and insulin all firing in a dysfunctional way. All of a sudden you start to see all these other issues come up. I'm retaining sodium. My lipids are elevated. My sleep is disturbed. My sex hormones are down. People start to feel pretty poorly as their glucose gets out of balance and their stress hormones are fluxing and their thyroid is going down. So it's just important to keep that in mind that when that glucose goes up, it's having a cascade of metabolic effects in your body. And obviously, we've seen things like cortisol and belly fat linked. Why is that going on? Because as cortisol goes up and our insulin goes up and our ability to process glucose goes down, we're going to store more visceral fat, and that becomes an engine for inflammation signaling in your body. And of course, body mass index goes up as your stress levels go up and you have more increased markers of inflammation. But keep in mind, if you're thinking about this in a breathing organism, what do you do when you're under stress? I eat more sugar and more comfort food. What's that do? It raises my blood sugar. How am I going to effectively deal with that? Well, you're not, because your insulin's going to go up. You're going to trigger more oxidized LDL. You're going to trigger more free radicals. And because that inflammation is taking place, you begin to affect the insulin receptor. And, just to mention that stress and immune function is really important. As your immune system gets out of balance, you create more inflammatory cytokines, and that creates that problem at the insulin receptor. And then stress and cognitive function. Remember, when people become less efficient, they don't utilize glucose in their brain real well, and hence that's why Alzheimer's disease is called type 3 diabetes in some circles. And you just have to keep in mind that it could be partly a problem of stress response causing damage to the hippocampus. It could be stress response in poor glucose regulation. And so remember, blood sugar is not operating in a vacuum. When your brain is firing at its peak capacity, it should be able to utilize glucose for fuel. And the less efficient it gets, the more you need to use fats. And that's why people do better when they have, cognitive dysfunction, when they go on higher fat diets or pseudo ketogenic diets. But I worry about when people are on ketogenic diets and they go, oh my gosh, I can't believe how great my brain feels. That tells me how damaged their insulin receptors are most likely and how poorly they're utilizing glucose. So just keep that in mind. Obviously, cortisol is important on stress fractures. Why is this important to think about? Because people that are chronically having blood sugar problems and they're chronically stressed out and they gain weight starts to create a load on their skeletal tissue and needs to be accounted for. Otherwise, it's easy to, crack a hip, have stress fractures. And this was just a couple of studies showing correlation of metabolic syndrome, of course, which is prediabetes, prehypertension, elevated lipids, and being obese. So MET-S correlated with dysregulation of the HPA axis. Higher morning cortisols were reported. Increased cortisol increases the risk of MET-S. This was another interesting study in 2013. 1,258 people ages 16 to 64 with their hair cortisol levels analyzed. Higher prevalence of MET-S reported with those with elevated long-term cortisol secretion. Yeah, so the more people are stressed out, the more their insulin receptors are out of balance. And so you need to be thinking about, what am I going to teach them for stress response? We're going to get them to do some deep breathing. What else can we do to facilitate getting their metabolism under control? They may need to take something for stress, right? They take theanine. They could take, any number of nutrients that could be of benefit to keep their cortisol dampened so that they manage their stress and don't feel overcommitted. Now, the next step that happens is when people get under stress, they start to lose their sleep capacity. And you have to understand that for the most part, sleep is a disorder of hyperarousal. And when it gets out of sync, core body temperatures change, melatonin signaling changes, cellular repair does not occur as it should, memory begins to erode. And this thought of hyperarousal is central to figuring out how you're going to help people to sleep better. And why do I need to help people to sleep better, other than it's really good for them, is that when you have disturbed sleep, your blood sugars get out of balance. So disturbed sleep leads to things like elevated cortisol. Elevated cortisol, more thyroid binding globulin gets released. That binds up your thyroid. Both of those things having negative pressure on your insulin receptors. And so when you think of it, CNS arousal, keeping you awake, people using stimulants during the day like caffeine, nicotine, they can't sleep. They start to get fearful of that loss of sleep. And it can even begin to create anxiety and depression when they can't get a chronic good night's sleep. But my point to this is, people can have blood sugar disturbances due to their problem with their sleep. And I'll show you one of the mechanisms that talks about it is cortisol and sleep. As your cortisol goes up, you don't get growth hormone release like you should. And chronic exposure to cortisol excesses disrupts your normal diurnal pattern. And the problem with that is, and I know I got a slide coming up, but I want to mention it now, is that it affects your insulin receptor and your beta cell release for the full next day. So people who chronically have trouble sleeping, chronically have trouble managing their blood sugar. Now, what are some of the strategies you can think of that might help people to calm down the inflammation that's around that? So when you look at an inflammatory reflex of the vagus nerve, when you have the vagus nerve functioning correctly, it inhibits inflammatory cytokine release and prevents tissue injury. when people are out of their vagal tonicity, they get increased tissue injury. And cholinergic agonists inhibit cytokine synthesis that protects against cytokine-mediated inflammation. So things like phospholipids are really good for people because it has that inhibition effect on inflammatory cytokine release. And why that's good is as I calm that down and I sleep and I'm not getting as many inflammatory neurochemicals being released, now my insulin receptor can start to function the way it was meant to again. This was the slide that I talked about that I think it's important to understand that melatonin influences insulin secretion. It does so via its G-coupled receptors, both M1 and M2, and interferes with insulin secretion from the beta cells and transmits circadian timing information to the islets. So when your circadian rhythm is off and say you're eating late at night or you're working night shift or you're under a lot of stress and cortisol and you don't get enough melatonin, you can't regulate your islet cells or your insulin influence appropriately. So it's important to notice that if you look in the red here, new evidence for the role of melatonin in glucose regulation. Cortisol causes melatonin metabolism problems. I showed you that a couple of slides ago. Melatonin metabolism problems cause glucose regulation problems. So in addition to thinking about fenugreek and cinnamon and magnesium and zinc and B vitamins, you'll also have to think about, well, what am I going to do for sleep and cortisol? So whether you're using melatonin for counter-regulation or you're dampening your stress response during the day so that a person is able to sleep at night, or maybe both. People with sleep problems end up having blood sugar imbalances. And look, sleep is a big issue, and it's been shown over and over again. So if you look, 67% of Americans have frequent sleep problems. 43% lack of sleep interferences with their daily activities. So a lack of sleep causes their daily activities to be damaged. And then 9 to 12% of the population are clinically diagnosed with insomnia. I just have to tell you that almost everybody comes into my office complaining of sleep problems or not getting enough sleep. So I think it's huge in terms of really straightening out people's blood glucose. And when you look at sleep deprivation here, this is where they showed in a linear way, the less sleep, the more chronic pain, the more metabolic imbalances, the more risk of hypertension, the more risk of obesity, the more risk of insulin resistance, all from a linear relationship, meaning the less sleep, the more likely these things are to happen. And once again, just to drive this home, elevated cortisol decreases serotonin and melatonin, causes blood sugar in the evenings to also increase. Elevated evening cortisol disrupts sleep, and it's a primary cause of insomnia. Hyperarousal is a primary cause, guys. Your brain's on fire. It can't turn off. You can't stop thinking about the day's events, or you're tired, but your brain feels wired. So you just can't, you have to keep it in balance. And I think that's what traditionally why we used adaptogens, was to try to keep people in balance, even though they knew they were under a lot of stress. If you look here, this is the NHANES-1 study showing that people with an averaging 5 hours of sleep a night had a 73% increased likelihood of obesity versus those who slept 7 to 9 hours a night. Well, yeah, the less you sleep, the more insulin resistant you become, the slower your thyroid gets, the more stress hormones you have, you're going to get fatigued and you're going to get fat. That's what's going to happen. And it's unfortunate, and a lot of people don't realize it. And there's the next piece to this, which when you get under stress, you take more of your T4 and convert it to reverse T3, and you'll just not make as much T3. And when you make less T3, you're going to have less energy, and your insulin receptors are not going to express themselves to the cell membrane the way they do when you're not insulin resistant. Now, there's other issues that relate to this. So toxins, for example, cause insulin resistance. So pesticides, things like BPA, glyphosates, arsenic, all associated with increasing inflammatory processes and potentially affecting blood sugar and glucose control. So even though there's a direct effect on insulin receptors, there's also this other effect of these toxins are knocking out thyroid function, which has a big effect on your metabolism. For example, thyroid hormone increases the number of mitochondria in your cell. That means you're going to have more powerhouses of energy. And it's important in terms of uptaking oxygen. It's important in terms of being able to derive literally every hormone in your body needs thyroid basically to help it function at the receptor. So thyroid hormones are really important. And what is one of the number one things that is listed for the metabolic effect of suboptimal thyroid function? What do you think? It's glucose tolerance, insulin resistance, and cardiovascular disease. So I guess in summary, what I'm wanting you to take away from this is there are problems that people have with glucose balance just because they eat poorly. You need to give them some things to help their insulin receptors and get their glucose under control and improve the way they eat. There are people that have stress, and because they have a lot of stress, they eat too much. Their cortisol causes their blood sugar to go up. Then there's people that have all three of the network. My glucose is up, my cortisol's up, my thyroid's down, I'm not making energy, I feel sluggish, my blood sugar's up, and I start having trouble sleeping. So you want to think of this as when you're looking at people with blood sugar problems, not that just they're a pancreas, but where are they in their continuum of where their metabolism has been disrupted so that you can really attack them with good nutrition, good counseling, good lifestyle medicine, all the things that can work to help their glucose metabolism in a more globalistic way. And I really want to thank you for your attention today. I think that this was a timely discussion with so many Americans suffering from blood sugar balance problems, and the fact that we can extend past thinking that it's just about the pancreas and just about blood sugar, and understand that organ systems like cortisol and thyroid, sleep disturbances from the HPA axis, all can have a dramatic impact on what's going on, along with things like stress and environmental influences. Until next time, this is Jim LaValle, clinical pharmacist, board-certified clinical nutritionist, wishing you a good day.